financial advisory firm in Sarasota, and he's also the founder of the Florida Overseas Investment Center, which is a regional center here in Florida. Very respected regional center. It covers the entire state and I think 9 different industries. They have a long and successful track record of sponsoring EB-5 projects, raising capital for EB-5 projects in various industries. They've done hotels and schools. They also were one of the first to put together a fund model and have investors coming into a fund that USCIS approved. I think they were the first. Roy has a long and successful track record as an investment banker in New York. He was also president of Trade Resources International, engaged in trade receivable securitization and credit enhancement programs with Fortune 500 companies in Latin America and other emerging markets. Jeff Carr is with us from Vermont. He is one of the go-to economists in the EB-5 arena. He has done economic impact analyses and reports for, I don't even know how many, probably 50 different, more than 50 projects in at least half the states in the country.
Too numerous to count.
Yeah, too many to count. You'll learn, if you don't know already, that an EB-5 economist is one of the essential players on your professional team if you're putting together a project or a regional center. So we're going to ask him to share some of his expertise with us in that area. So 1 minute of basics on the EB-5 program. It's an integration program, job creation program, and under the right circumstances, a viable source of financing for different types of projects. If your project's going to be EB-5 compliant and result in a green card for the investors, it must meet the following requirements. And this is true whether it's in a regional center or not. The investors are going to have to come in with $1 million or $500,000 in certain circumstances. They're going to have to invest in a new commercial enterprise, and they're going to have to show that the enterprise has the reasonable, or they're going to have to demonstrate that the investment is going to create, or in some cases save, 10 or more jobs for qualified U.S. workers. For those of you seeking to raise money through the EB-5 program, you've got a couple of options. 85% of the visas issued in this category are issued to investors in regional center sponsored projects. So you don't hear a lot of talk anymore about the standalone projects, the non-regional center projects, but they are still a viable means of raising capital. If you're not going to go with a standalone project, your first option is to associate with an already existing regional center. And we'll talk about why you may or may not want to do that. Third option would be potentially to buy an existing regional center. Last option would be to create your own regional center. So I'd like to ask Jeff first, before we get to the regional center scenario, is the standalone project a viable option these days?
Yeah, of course it is. You're right. The majority of investment and activity in the program is through the regional center program, but certainly some of the advantages for doing a regional center, there used to be, back in the old days with Dan and Roy, used to be, there's some cachet associated with regional centers, but now with 240 some of them out there, now the kind of uniqueness of the legitimacy of going through a regional center has become a little bit diluted. I think certainly the direct EB-5 program, there's a difference in timing in terms of when you can start to raise capital and the requirements that you have to go through with the USCIS before you can take your project into the marketplace. There's some expense differences because under the regional center program, they require you to do more homework. For example, under the regional center program, if you were going to do a project, because you can count jobs that are not specifically at the new EB-5 business enterprise, you have to do an economic job impact analysis. You need an economist that will develop a methodology for you that will allow you to be able to create jobs once you go out and raise money from your investors to prove the 10 jobs per investor math. And they take longer to adjudicate generally. If you were to start doing a regional center yourself, as an example, which is not what we're talking about here, but it's about a year to adjudicate one. If you go through an existing regional center, as long as the regional center is approved for the type of business in the industry that you want to go forward with, and you use the business structures and things like that the regional center's already approved for, once you get your applications together and you get Dan and Roy to say, okay, we'll take your project under our umbrella, then you can go into the marketplace, but that's a little bit of a process. And the direct, because it doesn't involve as much homework, it's a little faster to put together. It's a little bit easier to get into the marketplace because you don't need a pre-approval from a regional center to come under their umbrella. You don't need a pre-approval from the USCIS. And with some of the adjudication uncertainties now that are surrounding the regional center program, the tenant occupancy issues, some of the other things that have been going out, we've had a memo out that's been a draft guidance memo now for over a year that they haven't been able to finalize yet. There is more interest in direct EB-5 than there was 2 years ago. But still, 85%, I think it might be more than 90% is, maybe even 95% is regional center-based activity.
Now, what types of projects lend themselves to a direct investment project as opposed to regional center project?
Yeah, let me just make a blanket generalization. A project that you want to raise EB-5 capital for that isn't a good candidate for the regional center program. Let me explain that a little bit. There's different types of businesses that are out there that are what economists refer to as non-export based. In other words, they don't make something or have a service that they sell beyond the borders of the immediate geographic area. Contrast a manufacturing facility that bottles milk with a fast food restaurant or a Subway or something like that. The geographic reach of that is dramatically different. The Subway competes with a lot of other restaurants in the area, and in the regional center program you have to take account for the competition that might happen. You have to prove that the new jobs at the business enterprise are new to the region too, not just to the individual business. In the direct EB-5 program, so if you've got a business that competes, you have to consider the competition. If you build a nice shiny new store and there's a bunch of stores that are around since the 70s and the 80s and you take customers away from them, you have to account for that in a regional center situation. In the direct EB-5, at least now, there is no requirement for you to do that. It's just focused on the business enterprise itself. You have to supply W-2 support for your new employees, and you have to prove that they have legal status to work in this country. And so all the competitive issues, understanding whether or not the business is going to compete with this business or that business, you don't have to worry about yet in the direct EB-5 program. Depending upon the attorney, the immigration attorney that you work with, some like to have the direct EB-5 have a market study to prove that the business is commercially viable, because the service won't approve your application if they, if, for example, in South Florida you wanted to open up a penguin breeding ground or something like that. The USCIS may challenge whether or not it's a reasonable thing to do in South Florida. If you have a market study that says, well, yes, we're going to do that because we're going to do it this way, that can bolster your application. The service will still, not take proposals that they don't think are commercially viable and approve them in either one of the programs. But the evidentiary burdens that you have under the regional center program is a lot higher than it is under the direct program, because, as I said earlier, you have to prove that the new jobs of your business in the regional center program are actually new to the economy and not just new to your business, and that your new jobs aren't going to take away from other businesses. So those are the types of projects that work well are the ones like the Subway store chains, the other types of services businesses, like if you wanted to open up a string of dry cleaners and use EB-5 capital to do it, those kinds of things. It's easier to make the case if you're a manufacturer that you're doing something that's export-based. It's easier if you're a tourism-based project like a hotel, as long as there's enough demand to do those through the EB-5 Regional Center program. So, those types of businesses, the ones that are more local in nature, I think lend themselves more to doing the direct EB-5 program.
And what's the limit, or is there a limit to how much you can raise for a standalone project, or how many investors you can pull together?
You are limited only by the number of W-2 jobs for qualifying workers that you can create. So if you're going to, I've seen people that have wanted to do direct EB-5s where they were going to create 500 jobs directly at the business. And the reason that they wanted to go direct was because they didn't want to wait for the regional center designation review schedule to work its way through the course. Now, recognize something, that when each petitioner goes through the immigration process and gets to the point where they want their conditions to be removed at the I-29 level, proving a large number of jobs that they were there full-time, 52 weeks a year, minimum of 35 hours a week, and that their I-9, which is their legal status to work, and proving that, that is a Herculean administrative task. So typically you don't see 100, 200, 300 job direct EB-5s. You usually see them in the 20, 30, or 40 employee range.
Another question on structuring the direct projects. Can you bring the money into one company and count jobs in subsidiaries? Or do all the jobs have to be created?
You can do it only under the regional center program. Under the direct program, there's two business entities that the USCIS looks at whenever you file an application. The first one is the new commercial business enterprise, or the expanded commercial business enterprise, and the other one is the job creating enterprise. In the direct program, they have to be the same. Or the business enterprise that the investor invests in, if that is not the enterprise that creates the jobs have to be created at a wholly owned subsidiary of that business. In the regional center program, one of the benefits of the regional center program is the job creating enterprise and the new commercial business enterprise under the EB-5 program don't have to be the same company or a wholly owned subsidiary. And a lot of times it's beneficial because that gives the sponsors and the project offerers some of the protections of being able to structure a business more advantageously than you can under a direct. You can pool investment under the direct EB-5, or at least that's what there's a guidance memo that's out there that's not final, at least that's what that memo says. And actually, even in a direct, as long as you say business enterprise, that is the owner the owner of two other business enterprises, you can actually divide the $1 million, which is the default amount under EB-5, between two businesses, as long as the businesses create enough jobs to satisfy the number of jobs that are needed to support the investors. So you can have a portfolio of projects in a direct EB-5, just like you can in the regional center, but there are business structure limitations to that, and that the job creating enterprise has to be wholly owned by the business enterprise that's newly created, that the immigrant investor is making their equity invested in.
What if a developer wants to pool capital from foreign investors and U.S. investors? Does that work?
I don't see that there's any prohibition on that anywhere.
Who gets credit for the job creation?
Well, the EB-5 investors gets credits for that. There is one consideration for you when you pool investors, and particularly if you bring in foreign investors that aren't participating through the EB-5 program. All of those, the source of the capital where the investment is made in that business enterprise is subject to the same rules and sourcing from legal sources that the immigrant investor has from the standpoint of the legality of the monies that are invested. So if you go down the road towards bringing in a partner as an equity investor from Mexico, you still might run into some issues, and the service may still ask you questions about whether or not that non-EB-5 investor's investment dollars were obtained from legal sources. So while there's no limitation on whether or not you can use international investors and bring them in with your EB-5 investors, non-EB-5 international investors, you have some practical issues you have to deal with.
Okay, in the direct projects, what role does the investor or the investors have to play? Do they need to play an active management role in the company, or can they be brought in as limited partners? Is that different from the regional center?
Good question. That's more a legal question than an economics question. In the EB-5 program, an EB-5 investor generally has to have at least a policy-making role. I mean, the default in all the private placement memorandums and securities documents that I've seen is that they either have to have a job title within the organization, subtype, where they have either some role in the decision-making or at least policy-making for the business enterprise. And the default language that's in most securities documents is if they have the same rights as a limited partner under the Uniform Limited Partnership Act, that generally suffices for the EB-5 managerial role. They cannot be passive investors. If they're passive investors, you could run into trouble that, where you have something where they have absolutely no say. They have to have at least some ability to affect that. And I believe it's the same for both the Regional Center program and the direct program, although I've never run into that in the direct program.
All right, one more question for you. You mentioned the market analysis that's sometimes helpful in the direct project. Is that something that an EB-5 economist such as yourself does? Do you get involved in writing business plans for direct programs?
Well, what we do is, since they don't need an economic and job study for a direct program because they're only going to have to supply the W-2 data, we do business plans under both programs. And so people have asked us, well, you do business plans for the Regional Center program, help us do it for a direct program. We've done that 6 to 8 times over the last 3 or 4 years. So we've done that, and they seem to have worked out well. Whether or not, how much support in the file or in the particular case for a project that the team wants depends upon what your appetite for risk is as a project developer. I will tell you that there are some immigration counsel that do direct that only in very limited circumstances do they think that they need to have the proposer of a direct project go out and prove the commercial viability. If you're doing a Subway, okay, if Subway wants to do 3 branch stores in the area that you're at, they usually have done a pretty good job of their homework and they know what the characteristics are of an area that they like to go in. But if you were doing a Jim's instead of a Subway and it wasn't a national chain, the Immigration Council might tell you, go out and get a market study because it's not a national chain, it's, and you don't want to have, after you file investor petitions in a direct, have the RFE come back and have the USCIS question the commercial viability of the project that your investor is investing in. Getting RFEs at the 526 phase isn't fun for anybody who's involved in the project. It's not a lot of fun for regional centers as well. You can't avoid all of them. There's a lot of RFEs that come on source of funds, but it's something that you can do that could take one of those issues that's a potential risk off the table. A lot of immigration attorneys will tell people that do direct EB-5 projects, even though it's not required and we haven't gotten anything in writing from the service that says it's required, go ahead and do that. Just, it'll strengthen the application and eliminate one part of the risk in doing a project and getting it approved and getting your investors going and getting the business venture going forward.
RFEs, just so you all know, are requests for additional evidence from the Immigration Service.
Right.
So it's kind of the bane of our existence. But
there's a bunch of those things. There's RFEs, which are requests for evidence, which basically used to be bad in the program. I actually tell clients they're actually good now because that means you have the attention of somebody at the USCIS and they're looking at your project. A lot of times the RFEs come because the service has found something that they think might not be in compliance with EB-5. They may have a question that they didn't feel was fully explained in the application, or something in the application might have confused them. Although I will tell you, it's never been easier in the history of the program now to confuse an examiner than it is right now. And it's your opportunity to educate. It's your opportunity to interact. And given the adjudication times now for some of these projects, and even after a regional center is up and going, some of the adjudication times for their investor petitions are surprisingly long. And so what used to be a bad thing in the EB-5 program, get an RFE, is actually now not so bad because at least you've got the process going and you have a little bit of an idea of how long it's going to take. The other thing that you don't want to get, the other alphabet soup, is a NOID, a notice of intent to deny, or a notice of termination for your regional center. Those things are really bad, and we can talk about those later. But a notice of intent to deny comes after you've had several RFEs and the service still isn't satisfied. They will actually come back at you and say, we're going to deny your application, and they were supposed to say, here's why. And so then you have an opportunity to answer those here's why, and then after it goes back to them, they come back and say, we're not persuaded, we're gonna deny you. Now you have the opportunity to actually go to something called the decision board. So you can actually show up in person and see the people who have been looking at your application and have a dialogue and have them ask questions and you answer them. It's kind of new. I only know of one attorney that's been before it in my sphere of things. I don't know if you guys know anybody that else has been in front of it. I have mixed feelings about it. On one hand, I'd like to go to one just to see what it was like, but that implies that I have a client with a terminated application and a denial, so I really don't want to do that. I would like to go observe, but they don't allow us obviously to do that. So there is a new animal out there. It's just only been around for about 3 or 4 months. And it came about because the stakeholders were, saying, why can't we talk to anybody about our application? Why does every communication have to be written and at arm's length? Can't we just sit down and work out what your concerns are, and we can try to answer your questions? And so this is what Director Mayorkas came up with. I think it's a positive thing, because if you're going to get denied, it gives you an opportunity to show up in person and actually have an interaction and find out what's going on and try to address their concerns.
Okay, Roy, our client has decided that they probably aren't going to create 10 direct or indirect jobs, and they're thinking they might be better off affiliating with a regional center. Tell us first, what exactly is a regional center?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Julie, and thank you, Carlton Fields, for allowing us to be here today. And one other thing I should say is that I am a co-founder of Florida Overseas, along with Julie Norton, who probably can answer any of your questions better than I can, and she's here today, so don't hesitate to talk to her.
She's up there.
Regional Center program came about in 2002, and it's essentially, if you want to see what the actual definition is, the best thing to do is go to the USCIS website. Not being an attorney, I'm not going to read that for you, but I'll give you the practical answer, and that is that it is an intermediary between USCIS and the two sides of the transaction, which are essentially those people who want to get green cards and those people who are looking for capital. So we sit in the middle. The regional center comes about through a licensing process. There's an application which is made to USCIS. Originally, there was no real format for it. Our approval took place in 2009, and at that time, there was no format as it relates to an application. You kind of winged it and hoped that you put it together right, or you hired an attorney who had a really good record in getting approvals. And you send it in, and you get an approval letter which says you are now a regional center and you are authorized to operate in the EB-5 arena as a regional center for a certain geographic area and for certain industries. Now there's a process which is it's been more formalized. There's a Form 924 which is submitted, and it's a much more structured application. But the result is still the same, and that is that there's a vetting process of both the people that are sponsoring the regional center, the area where you want to operate, the industries in which you want to operate, and ultimately you're going to have a project to get a regional center. You can get a regional center without a project, but the first thing that's going to happen is they're going to say you're not going to be able to do any business until you have a project, and then it will be vetted as if it were part of the application.
What are the different types of regional centers out there?
Well, again, I'm not going to try to give you a formal answer, but the practical matter is that there are regional centers like the state of Vermont, which essentially will sponsor any project that meets their criteria. There are regional centers like Florida Overseas, which is really probably best described as a kind of investment bank. And then there are regional centers that have been put together to enable a developer to raise capital through the EB-5 program to fund a specific project. And then there's all kinds of hybrids in the middle of those three.
And it just, there are, the state of Vermont is what we often refer to as a purely public regional center. It's owned by the state of Vermont. And then there are public-private partnerships like Dan Healy, who you heard from this afternoon. That City of Dallas formed a regional center, and Dan Healy's company, Civitas Capital Management, manages the investments for the City of Dallas Regional Center. And then there are more purely private.
Yeah, there are some regional and local economic development organizations that are moving in the direction of having, I mean, there's cities, in addition to Dallas, there's New Orleans, another state regional center is in Idaho, there's one in Hawaii, which probably operates a lot like Dan's does. It's owned by the state, but it's operated and managed by a private sector. Vermont is pure, it's staffed by state employees, and they have a much different way of doing it. They charge an amount per investor at I-526 approval, and that's the way they get their funding, but they're primarily funded by the taxpayers in the state of Vermont, because Vermont has decided that the EB-5 program is a good way to bring jobs. And so it's funded by the general taxpayer. There's very few regional centers that are funded by the taxpayers.
I believe the city of Miami has a pending regional center.
Yeah, St. Louis has a pending one, the Dayton area has a pending one. There's a whole bunch of them out there that have moved in that direction, because local economic development organizations, regional economic development organizations are seeing this as a way to complement how to bring capital, investment capital in at a time when it's very difficult to raise investment capital.
How many regional centers are there out there right now?
It's like 244.
Is it?
I'm,
Yeah.
I'm within one or two.
Yeah, it's been there for quite a while. There's only been like one approval of a regional center, I think, in the last 3 months, isn't
Yeah,
that
I
right?
have the new stats, it's pretty low.
Yeah. There's been no denials, but there's only been one approval, I think, in the last 3 months.
But I think it's a relatively new phenomenon. We're not talking about a mature industry. When Florida Overseas was approved, there were 22 regional centers in the country. And there was one in Florida, and that one was inactive. So, and that was in 2009. So that gives you an idea about how.
I've actually got the stats right here. In 2007, there were 11. In 2008, 25. 2009, 72. Now we're at 244 or something. So.
The state of Vermont got approved in 1997. That was our first EB-5 assignment back in 1997. And at the time, I think there was only 2 others in the entire country at the time. And actually, there's only, I think, 6 regional centers now that have gone entirely through the immigration process, where people have got their permanent residency and had the conditions removed.
Yeah, that's
And
true.
I think that's largely because the program really has grown a lot since the 2005-2006 timeframe. And because of that, because the immigration, it takes a while to get a project started, it takes a while to market, it takes a while for your investors to get approved at the first level of immigration review. And then 2 years later, 21 months actually later, they file their last immigration petition, and then that has to get adjudicated. It's a 5-year process by the time you get done.
Roy, tell us, how does the developer decide which regional center to work with? What goes into that calculus?
Well, first of all, it's a great question, and it's not, I don't have an easy answer for you. Regional centers have different motivating forces that drive them. I can obviously talk about Florida Overseas, and we have really 2 clients. One client is the individual who is looking to get permanent residency in the U.S., and the other client is the end user of the capital, the person who's looking to get money. And those interests are not aligned. They're pretty much opposites. The person who is looking to get the residency most wants to be sure that the project will take place, so his appetite for risk is very low. He wants to make sure that, and that means he needs to see that the jobs are going to get created. So once again, he needs to see that all of the capital that's necessary for completion of the project is in place. It's like well, what if I'm not, I can see that if you're raising $25 million and that means that you need to have 50 investors, being number 49, I don't mind that position, but I don't want to be number 5, because what happens if something goes wrong? I've moved my family, or I'm planning on doing it, and now they're on their way back to Afghanistan or wherever. So that's the, and the other thing that the investors are looking for is how and when am I going to get my money back? Return is much less important to the investors than is the surety of his green card. We've had many people tell us, and I'm sure you'll hear more about this in the second panel, but we've had many people tell us that if we could guarantee that they get the green card, they'd give us the $500,000 and just go away. So, so having said that, then the other side is that the person who is looking to raise capital is driven by the same forces that drive all capital, and that is they're looking for the cheapest source and probably the least amount of collateral and guarantee. So the idea is that as a regional center, our job is to try and marry those two needs and bring those folks together in a way that you actually get something done. I think one thing I would suggest is that EB-5 is a source of capital, but anybody who is in the development world that is thinking EB-5 is going to be the source of capital for a project is probably mistaken. We generally say to people, if you can't raise the money any other way, you probably are not going to be successful with an EB-5 project. I'm not saying cost, and I'm not saying necessarily the ultimate terms, but if you can't get the money from some other source, you probably aren't going to get it out of EB-5.
What about the geographic scope and industry limitations? Is that something developers need to?
It's actually gotten better, and Jeff can probably help me with this. But originally there was a lot of restriction as it relates to the job creation being limited to the area in which the regional center was specifically authorized, and I think that the adjudication process and interpretation of that has expanded a lot.
Actually, it was always expanded. They narrowed it, and then we had to fight like heck to get them to go back to the original program interpretation.
But what about, I'm thinking more in terms of regional centers have specific geographic scopes, and not that they can't be changed, but they have scopes and industries that they're approved to raise capital for, right?
Right. Well, when you apply as a regional center, you have to pick a geographic or political area in which to apply, and then the process is if you're not approved for the place where the project is going to be located, then the regional center won't work. I mean, it's that simple. And it can be a little bit absurd. I know that there was a project in Louisiana a number of years ago, which was much needed, and it was some sort of a boating or fishing operation, and it got denied because the boats left the port where the facility was located. They said, well, it's not in the geographic area anymore. Your job creation is not there. So it's a fairly technical process, but you want to make sure that the job creation and the actual function of the enterprise is located within the scope of the regional center.
And how do you find out what the regional and geographic scope of a regional, or the industry and geographic scope of a regional center is?
Well, in the approval letter, it's very specific. When you talk to someone, if you're going to talk to someone who is an existing regional center, that's one of the first things you want to look at is their regional center approval letter, because all these things are laid out as to what they can do and where they can operate and what kind of industries they can operate in. We also went through some other changes. Originally, when you put in for an industry approval, you said something like healthcare or entertainment or hospitality. Now they have narrowed that, and you have to work with the NACIS codes. In the beginning, they were asking for 5 or 6 digits. Now I think it's pretty much accepted it's at 4. Is that right? So they've gotten a lot better on that, but you still have to work with specific NCIS codes. And each year, the regional center has to continue to update that process with USCIS as to their specific authorized regional scope and industry approvals.
Yeah, just to add to what Roy said, you want to look at both initial regional center designation letter that they got when they approved the regional center. You also want to ask them if they've had any amendments and get copies of those approval letters, just so you have the full range of the specific area that they're allowed to operate in. And sometimes they file amendments to expand that area because regional centers are living organisms. And then if they expand into new industries, like if they were first approved to do hotels and resorts, and then they brought in a lawnmower manufacturer or something like that, they have to file an amendment in order to do that, and they have to submit evidence to show how they're going to promote economic growth. So get all their approval letters so that you have the full picture.
And I would also add to that you want to see any exemplar petition that's been filed as well. Exemplars are now amendments, but they weren't originally, and a lot of times, I'll digress, an exemplar is an application for an I-526 that doesn't have a human being attached to it.
It's like hypothetical.
It's like it's a hypothetical application which is submitted to USCIS, and if approved, theoretically, the part that's been approved will not be re-adjudicated when submitted with the individual, so long as there haven't been any changes. But a lot of times, in approving an exemplar, there will be additional limitations and also rights and privileges granted. I mean, for example, Florida Overseas originally was only allowed to use implant, but in one of our exemplar
That's an
petitions-
indirect job counting methodology.
It's
That's,
an account.
yeah, it's what we use.
What Jeff uses.
Yeah.
But in one of our exemplar petitions, our pre-approval petitions that we submitted, we added RIMS 2, and once that was approved, then that expanded the scope of what kinds of things that our regional center could do.
As a regional center operator, what types of information are you looking for from developers? What do you need to know whether it's someone you can work with or not?
Well, I think maybe this is going to flow into the next question as well. But the first thing that we would ask is, where is the potential project going to be located? And we would go about finding out whether it's in a TEA, targeted employment area, which means, is it eligible for the $500,000 investment as opposed to $1 million? The practical reality is that no one will invest $1 million to get a green card if they can do it for $500,000. So unless you have a group of people that you specifically control and you know that they want to put up $1 million into your project, don't even think about it. So if it's not in a TEA, we wouldn't look at it. Once we determine that it's in a TEA, the next thing we would ask for is to call Jeff and say, here's the basics of what I'm trying to do. Can you give me a back of the envelope ballpark as to what kind of job creation scope there's going to be? What can we reasonably expect? And what that's going to do is it's going to give you an idea as to the total amount of EB-5 capital that you're going to be able to put into your capital stack. If in fact Jeff says, well, I'm guessing that you're going to be somewhere in the order of 300 jobs, then what you're going to say is well, okay, what does 300 jobs, that means that 300 jobs divided by 10, that means that I can have 30, and then you're going to say, well, okay, 30 means $15 million, and then people like Florida Overseas are going to say, well, that's nice, but we're going to haircut you by at least 30%, so maybe you can get $11 million.
Yeah, and by haircut, what he means is, if your project's going to create 300 jobs, nobody's going to allow you to use all 300 jobs because they know stuff happens when we develop projects. And so if Roy was going to go market your project, when he went out and talked to investors, the investors, since they're interested in job creation, are going to say, well, you can't cut it that close. And Roy says, I know that. we're gonna give you a 20% or 30% cushion on those jobs. So if you're creating 300 jobs, they're gonna probably take 90 and allow you only to use 210 jobs, or get money from 21 investors, because they know that Roy's been down this road, this isn't his first rodeo, he knows that stuff happens when you develop projects. So, and the investors will also say, you're cutting it too close, you can't, you know, if you raise money from 30 investors for 300 jobs and you only create 297, that's indistinguishable in the business world, but your last investor won't get the conditions removed, and your project will get a black eye. And he won't want that to happen to his regional center.
Good regional center operators won't. So that's one thing you should make sure to inquire of regional center operators, to the extent that you're talking to a number of them. If they're being too, if they're cutting that number too close and telling you can use all the jobs being projected, then that might be a red flag.
They might not be as experienced in the marketplace. When they get to the next panel and you talk to John Zhang, he won't even look at your project if you're trying to do that.
So then the next thing that we would do is we'd say, okay, well, you know, how much is the total cost of your project, and you know, and who are you, and have you done this before, and how are you going to pay these people back someday, and then what we're going to say also is, and this is a very tough one for most developers when we sit down with them, is I'm going to look at them and I'm going to say, well, okay, we can get maybe $11 million out of the EB-5 program. Your project is going to cost $16 million. Number one, where's the $5 million coming from? And number two, if we run into a problem after we've already brought in 2 or 3 investors, what's your alternative capital plan? Where are you going to get the money if after we've started, it doesn't work? Because we can't go into the marketplace and say to a client, or we won't do it, and say, listen, put your money into this, apply for an I-526, move your family, and then all of a sudden something changes, and because the project doesn't get built because we didn't raise the total amount of money, you have to go home. We would only get away with that once.
Jeff, back to the TEA. So Roy's not even going to look at a project if it's not in a TEA. What is a TEA, and how do you figure out whether your project's in a TEA?
TEA means Targeted Employment Area. And under the EB-5 program, they go through a lot of the same things that some of you may be familiar with New Markets tax credits. There's a way to qualify for New Markets tax credits, and there's a whole bunch of things you got to go through. A couple of those actually are what we use in the EB-5 program. The targeted employment area, the only reason for it is that qualifies you for the $500,000 investment. And as Roy said earlier, if the primary objective of the immigrant investor is to get their unconditional residency at the end of this process, no one's going to pay a project developer or regional center $1 million for something they can get for $500,000 from 24 other projects in the marketplace. So the first hurdle is qualifying for the targeted employment area and qualifying for the EB-5 investor minimum of $500,000. There's 3 ways that you can do that. The easiest way, and the way for you to, be the best and most stable, is you can put your project in what is a federally defined rural area. Now, oddly enough, it's not the U.S. Department of Agriculture's definition of a rural area. It is a rural area as defined by the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, which is in the White House, which says that your county that your project is located in is not in any of the counties that are identified as being part of a metropolitan statistical area. There's 385 of them out there. They're all composed of a group of counties. Some of them are small, some of them are big. The one we're in right now, Miami-Dade, has 3 counties, essentially. But those 3 counties have a heck of a lot of people. And the whole country is divided into these. And so if your project is located in a county that is not in one of those 385 metropolitan statistical areas, you have a chance to be a rural area which means that $500,000 deal applies, and that doesn't change until the next time the census comes out. So it's usually good for 10 years from the time that it's there.
There's 28 rural counties in Florida, and it's pretty much the spine of the state,
Right.
wrapping around up towards the Panhandle.
Right, and feel bad for the people in New Jersey because every single county is in the metro area. And so that's number one. That gets you to the next filter, which is if you're in a rural area, but you're in a municipality with a population of greater than 20,000 people, you don't qualify as a rural area. You have to go the way of the non-rural area. But if you're in a municipality that's less than 20,000 residents per the last census, so it would be the 2010 census, you qualify. You're there, it won't change for 10 years, and if the population of the municipality is 5,000 people, you're probably going to be in an area forever. Now, the reason that's important is the targeted employment area and the $500,000 minimum is effective only the time the investor makes their investment into the project, which is either when they file a first immigrant investor petition or basically put the money in escrow. And I know that there's some disagreement in the immigration community about just when the money's put at risk and when that timing of that is, because if you put it in escrow, is it really at risk? That's generally the rule that we use. So that's what you want to try to do. If you are in a non-rural area, the only way you can qualify is if your project is located in an area that could be constructed that has an unemployment rate that's 150% of the US average. So if the unemployment rate is 10% in the US, the 150% average has to be 15. Most states use the average unemployment rate for the US. States have control over how they designate this. Most states, like the state of Florida, uses the trailing calendar year annual average. So we're in 2012 right now, they're using 2011 annual average data. And what they do is they calculate the US, and then they say, okay, our threshold in the state of Florida is X. I think it's 13.5% now in Florida.
Yes.
So what they do is we look for all the cities and towns, all the counties. Beneath the cities and towns, we can get down to something called the census tract or even a census block group, looking for parts of the geography that have an unemployment rate that's greater than roughly 13.5%. The interesting thing is that most states, like the state of Florida, what you can do is if you look and you're in a census tract and you happen to be unlucky and your unemployment rate's like 13.1%, it's not 13.5%, a lot of states will allow you to look at areas, other census tracts around it, group them together, total up the labor force, total up the number of unemployed, do the division, and if you hit the threshold, you can have that be your area. California is a lot more restrictive, Illinois is a lot more restrictive, but in Florida, the Innovation Board works very well with the regional centers and the program. They understand the importance of job growth, so they're relatively lenient when it comes to putting things together. I mean, some of these TEAs look like amoebas sometimes, and that caused some consternation in the program a little while back. But in this guidance memo that came out that's a year old, the USCIS has said that they will defer to the states in terms of what is the geography of targeted employment area, as long as it uses the most recent statistics, and the statistics work, and they're really 150% of the US average. There is a wide variation among all the states the way they do it. Florida is a good state to be in for custom high unemployment, targeted employment areas, and so you're operating in a good state.
I'll give you a couple of examples. On the rural side, Monroe County is one of the rural counties. The city of Key West, though, has more than 20,000 people. So you get a designation of TEA for Monroe County and Stock Island, but you couldn't do a project in Key West itself.
We call them Swiss cheese TEAs.
To talk about the combined area TEAs, Florida Overseas currently is sponsoring an intercontinental hotel project, which is located next door to the Swimming Hall of Fame in Fort Lauderdale, which is not an area that someone would think of as being a TEA, and it is a TEA and has been designated such 3 times.
Sometimes you get into some weird stuff with TEAs. You know, think of this, you know, somebody wants to come in and do really high-end spas, you know, with all the things. Oh, and by the way, we're gonna put them in economically distressed areas. So, you know, sometimes things get kind of silly in this, and you'd be surprised what goes on and what gets defined as a high unemployment rate, targeted employment area. But to make the project go, it's gotta happen, otherwise the project won't be a good candidate for the EB-5 program, and not every project is a good candidate for the EB-5 program.
Roy, back to regional centers. What types of services do regional centers provide to the developers in particular?
Well, I think that, you know, what we try to do is we try to realistically inform the principles of the development, you know, what EB-5 can do for them, where EB-5 might fit in their capital stack, what the realistic costs are going to be, because EB-5, like all sources of capital, costs more and takes longer than anyone originally expects. And we try to get developers to understand, you know, what they're going to have to go through. And I don't want to be discouraging because this is our business, but the other side of it is that it's not really easy, and it does take time, and you are dealing with a government agency that maybe you don't have to. I mean, we all have to deal with lots of government agencies, but you're adding one more into the mix. So we try to give a reasonable analysis as to what the developer can expect and what the costs are going to be. It certainly is a lot less expensive to raise money for a hospital or a school than it is for a hotel or a restaurant. I mean, that's just a fact. And the reason is that in the investor world, the EB-5 investor who's looking for his green card is going to say, well, if I see something that's funded by the state or the federal government, I'm a heck of a lot more comfortable that it's actually going to happen if all the approvals are in place than if it's purely a private exercise.
Just let me train of thought. I had a question for you. Oh, investors. Do regional centers have sources of investors? I mean, are you going to bring the investors to the table for the developers? Some yes, some no. How does that work? 'Cause I think some developers have the impression that.
Depends on how big our fee is. No, it's we do have relationships with many sources of investors. The raising of capital for EB-5 is evolving, and when we first started, Julie and I thought that, you know, that people would be standing in a line to do this, and we discovered that that's really not the case. You got to go out and find them, and you're in competition, and capital is scarce, and there's a lot of scam artists in the business that are trying to pass off projects that are not, you know, not worthwhile, and there's been enough people now burned through bad projects that the due diligence process on the part of the investors and on the part of the agents internationally, it has increased tenfold over the last 2-3 years. So the answer is yes, we will work with the client to find investors. But if you don't have your own investors, you know, you have to recognize the fact that you're going to have to pay somebody to bring those investors in, and that cost is going to have to get amortized over the life of the capital usage, and you need to add it into the overall cost when you analyze whether EB-5 is a viable source of capital for your project.
And can you say in general terms what it costs to affiliate with a regional center, or explain how regional centers get paid?
I can't tell you how all regional centers get paid, and obviously the public ones are going to be different than ours. we do is we're usually free up until the point where we make the decision as to whether or not we, would like to do business. And then we will ask for a retainer. There's a lot of costs that are involved with this. You're having a securities offering. So generally speaking, there's going to be the preparation of private placement memorandums and partnership or LLC operating agreements, subscription agreements. Probably you're going to use an escrow arrangement. It's not a requirement, but it's normal in the business. So you have to have an escrow bank, and there has to be the management of the escrowing process. Then there's the monitoring of the job creation, which takes place over a period of years. So all of that's part of the expense. But when we talk to people, we outline exactly what that's going to be, and generally speaking, our clients look at it and they amortize it over the life of the investment, which is usually 5 years. They come up with a rate, and they say either it works or it doesn't. But that's the way it's done.
Okay. I just got a time warning, so I want to inquire of Jeff about the economic impact report, and then talk a little bit about creating a regional center, because I know there's some people in the audience that want to talk about that too. So we talked about what kind of information Roy needs from developers to sort of figure out whether he wants to work with them or not. Once you all decide to work together, what do you need to know in order to run the numbers?
I have a smart aleck answer that we can take out in 10 seconds, or I can explain it. What I really want, and what I would really love to see, is an EB-5 compliant business plan that I can look, evaluate, I can score the job creation for the projects, because the investors are going to rely on the economic and job impact study to come up with enough jobs so that every investor has at least 10 jobs that can be allocated to them in their investor petition.
So how about if we hire you to write our EB-5 compliant business plan? What does it look like?
We can do that too. An EB-5 compliant project business plan looks just like a business plan that you would file with a bank, that you would want to go out and get traditional financing with. But that's what I call the EB-5 compliant wrapping. There are certain things in a project business plan that the USCIS is going to want to see. They're going to want to see that you understand, in your project what it's like to be a good EB-5 project business plan. Roy's not going to take you in unless you have a good, or at least plans to develop a good EB-5 compliant business plan. And what the service is specifically looking for is information that's contained in a precedent-setting decision that is called the matter of HO, H-O. And in that, they lay out very specifically what they want you to provide in the business plan. They want a good description of what it is you're trying to do. They want a good, well-developed, fully supported set of operating pro formas for the new business enterprise. They want you to have gone out, got a good solid construction budget, and in some cases they want you to go out and get a third-party evaluation of it, maybe from someone who evaluates construction budgets for commercial lenders, to opine on both that your costs are reasonable and that the timeline that you assembled and put together for developing the project is reasonable. Short of that, they will want at the minimum you to go out and take your construction budget and compare it to some industry standard source for construction costs, like RS means or something like that, and say, well, for example, in southeast Miami, a 25-story building with this kind of configuration generally runs about X dollars a square foot between this range, and they want to see that your project is within that range. Or if it isn't, that you have a good explanation for why it isn't. Beyond that, they're going to want to talk about, they want to know who your competitors are. What's your strategy for, filling some unmet market demand that maybe your competitors aren't filling. They're also going to want to know what you need for permits, business licenses to not only construct but also to operate the business. They're going to want to see a whole host of information that demonstrates that your project if you're going for an exemplar approval with your project, that it's shovel ready. And so the way that you demonstrate to them that it's shovel ready is that you have answers to all the matter of requirements that they have. And if you don't, you run the risk of them saying, well, okay, but we don't think your project is shovel ready. Come back when your project's shovel ready. And if you've got a bunch of investors lined up and you're trying to go through Roy's regional center, he would never let you get to the point where you weren't shovel ready before he approved you. But if you have a bunch of investors lined up, that delay could kill you. They could end up going to somebody else who's got something that fits their schedule more than what your project is. So that's just an example. If you have trouble sleeping at night, if you want to read that decision, it's very illuminating, and it actually lays out a list of things that have to be in the business plan, which is essentially on top of a good, solid, traditional business plan. Your good, solid, traditional business plan, in my opinion, gets you about 65% of the way there to a good EB-5 compliant project business plan. I don't know if you...
No, we do that as well. I mean, one of the things
Right, you can do that through a certain
one of the things that we
regional
insist on is that if Part Overseas is the sponsor, we want to write the business plan because we can't afford to have it turned down. It has to pass. And there's a secret to it. You have a lot of pictures.
I don't want to go too technical on everybody, but Jeff, tell us about the modeling, economic modeling tools that are maybe most used by USCIS, and whether certain tools are more suitable for use in certain industries.
Well,
in-plan and hospitality and something another.
Yeah, I mean that's a good question, but a lot of things are case-specific, fact-specific, project-specific. A good economist will work with you and work with the regional center to say, okay, there's this list of things that have been part of successfully adjudicated cases in this program. Two, Roy's already talked about. One is RIMS 2 multipliers, which are multipliers that are maintained by the U.S. Commerce Department. There's a program out there called In-Plan, which basically has taken those multipliers and automated it within a software program, which makes it more user-friendly for people instead of having to do matrix math and spreadsheets. There also is there are dynamic input-output models. One is called REMI, Regional Economic Models Incorporated out of Amherst, Mass. And actually, when you look at the field adjudicators training manual, they actually say in that the USCIS thinks that REMI PI Plus is best for this program, which is kind of startling. That's another thing. If you have trouble sleeping, the 1,078-page examiner's training manual is really interesting reading. If you're interested and you really want to get into the nuts and bolts of what it's like to deal with an EB-5 project. And then there's another one we use quite a bit. It's a dynamic model. It's Redine. It's out of Tucson, Arizona, maintained out of Tucson, Arizona. And all four of these tools have been successfully used in dozens, if not hundreds. Probably the two most prevalent are In-Plan and RIMS 2. Basically what an economist is going to do is take what you're going to invest in the way of construction or working capital into the business, look at the operations, the pro formas that you have for the business, and we're going to score it for the regional center. We're going to score the economic impacts. There are certain economic impacts that the service wants to see, and they want to see the impacts both within the regional center and outside the regional center. Because people sometimes forget, not only does the project have to be good for the regional center, but the project also should be positive for the U.S. economy as well. And sometimes people forget that. And of course, the most important thing is we're going to score what jobs that are created are eligible to be used in the 10 jobs per investor man. And not all jobs created by the project necessarily can be applied to that math. There's a million rules. We won't go into those weeds. If you want to get a beer and call me on the phone, I'll tell you about it.
All right, quickly, creating regional centers. Roy, under what circumstances would it make sense for someone to set up their own regional center? Given that there are already 244 out there.
I think that there's a real place to start your own regional center. If you're a developer and you have a specific development that you want to get done, you may not be able to find someone who feels that they can sponsor you or that has either the geographic or industry qualifications necessary to sponsor. The other part of it is that, Jeff mentioned that there's really only a handful of regional centers that have much of an operating track record, and most of those regional centers want to be a principal. So if you're looking for someone to be an agent and you're not located in Vermont or in the city of Dallas, you may not like the terms of the deal that are being offered. So if you start your own regional center, you control it. You don't have the risk of, there are a number of regional centers, particularly in Florida. I know Florida a lot better than the rest of the country. We call them rec centers, and you can go to them and they will, for a fee, let you use their regional center. I think the biggest risk associated with the rec center is that you don't know what else they've done. You don't have any idea whether they've sponsored another project which is about to tank, which could end up taking your project down or destroying all the work that you did to build up an investor base that we're ready to fund. So I'd be real careful with that, and I would always suggest that if you're making a choice between a rent-a-center and doing your own, I would pick do your own.
How much is it gonna cost someone to set up a regional center?
It depends on what you're looking to do, but if it's a project-specific regional center, it's probably going to be something slightly less than $100,000. You're going to have to hire an economist. You're going to have to hire an attorney. You have to go through corporate documentation. You're going to have to do the TEA analysis. You're probably going to have to, if you don't have any experience in EB-5, you're going to need to hire some sort of an EB-5 consultant who's going to be able to handhold you through the process. And I may be low, because I haven't looked at it for a couple of years.
He's low.
Okay, so I'm low.
You're also.
It used to be that.
Yes,
4 or 5 years
well,
ago.
yeah, back in 2009, before they elevated all these evidentiary requirements. If you adopt an approach where you actually have a project that you also want to get approved at the same time you get your regional center designation, that's the highest level of evidentiary burden that requires the largest amount of homework. It requires the most amount of dialogue back and forth with the USCIS. If you can get away with spending less than 150 grand, I will do this to you because you've done a great job. I know some people that have spent even more than 150K, and that's upfront working capital, so it's not insignificant money. But sometimes you're left with no other choice, because you may want to do a project, like if you want to breed penguins, you may never find a regional center that is approved for breeding penguins. And if you go to another regional center and you say, please amend your regional center for me to allow me to breed penguins, you really, the regional center is going to talk to you and say, do you realize how long it takes to get an amendment? And you're going to have to compare that to how long it would be to go through an application process for your own regional center, and they're not too terribly different.
We really don't have competition as a statewide regional center with a broad mandate as it relates to industries, because USCIS won't do it anymore.
Yeah, that's something I wanted to ask about, but Jeff in particular. What is the trend now? I mean, what if I have a client who wants to, since he's going to go to the expense of setting up a regional center, qualify the entire Southeast United States?
I will tell you that the size of the land area that you seek in your regional center designation application is directly proportional to the number of questions you're going to get about your regional center application. The larger the area, the more questions you're going to get. Generally, the USCIS now, gone are the days when I could help my client in Idaho take 2/3 of the state of Montana. He's lucky as heck, because he came in right at the right time. They were still entertaining large geographic areas. I have trouble now getting geographic areas that are like 40 counties, because the USCIS wants you to stay focused. They don't want you to have a big land area, because they want you to stay with a land area that is proportional to the size of the impact that your project that you're submitting for evidence and the industry that you're submitting evidence for will have. I had trouble with a client in the Southeast. It was a manufacturing firm that was using a byproduct of cotton production, And we tried to have an area that included the surrounding cotton production area, and they challenged us on that. And we had to shrink it down to a metro area, which was a fraction of the number of counties that was in play. So the larger the area you go for, the more grief you're gonna get, and the longer they're gonna drag out the review process. And so we tell people, let's keep it tight, focused, keep it simple. Don't give the opportunity to have a lot of questions raised about what it is that you're doing, because regional centers are living organisms, they can be amended. Even though the amendment process is a little painful now, hopefully at some point, I mean, gone are the days, Roy, when I could do an amendment in 3 weeks.
Oh, I know.
I did that for the state of Vermont back about 2.5 years ago. Now they're taking about 8 or 9 months.
It used to be that you could annex territory that was adjacent to the regional center. So for example, if you had Florida, I could take Georgia, or I could take Alabama, and I could expand the regional center to do that. Now the problem is that if you submit an amendment to USCIS for territorial expansion, they essentially will throw out all of the rulings that they have given you over your history, which could be very favorable. In our case, we have a lot of favorable rulings that we lean on, and they continue to honor. But they basically would say, okay, everything that's happened in the last 4 years, we're throwing that out and we're starting you over like a brand new regional center. So if I was going to do any expansion, I would do a new regional center, even if it was adjacent to Florida.
All right, now we're really out of time. Thank you both very much. Does anyone have any questions for Roy and Jeff now? I think we could entertain a few, and then we'll have time again at the end when all 4 panelists will be together. But we can entertain a few right now, yes?
You discussed the creation of jobs, and I just was curious about bankruptcies and saving jobs. Can EB-5 money be used for that?
Yeah, I guess you want me to handle that, or do you have any experience in trouble business?
I'll give you my short answer, and then Jeff can give you the official answer. I wouldn't touch it. The saving jobs process is more difficult. It involves a lot more scrutiny, and the odds of success are significantly diminished. So we don't play with it.
And that's I know a lot of people who've done projects and a lot of regional center operators that feel exactly that way. There are some regional centers and there are some people who have projects that say, what you're talking about, preserving jobs, is what they call a troubled business application. And to be a troubled business under the program, okay, most of the investors are sophisticated enough to know that to be a troubled business under the EB-5 program, you don't have to be in all that much trouble. It's an income statement measurement, 20% net losses in comparison to your net loss net worth on your balance sheet, and it can be done over a 12 or 24-month period. When you do that, the thing that you have to represent and present an inventory to the USCIS, that you have a certain number of positions at your company, and you have to maintain the pre-investment number of positions at your company for a period of not less than 2 years. Now, I know a lot of immigration attorneys that say, don't mess around with that 2 years thing. You want to maintain the number of positions until all your investors have cleared, and your last investors cleared the immigration process, which can be a 3, 4, or 5 year situation. Now, in the marketplace, and John will probably talk a little bit about this later, in some cases when you can preserve 100 jobs, say, at your company with a capital infusion, well, those 100 jobs just have to be maintained, they don't have to be created. And so for some investors, particularly the first 10 for that first 100 jobs, are saying, well, geez, all you got to do is maintain those jobs and I got my jobs. So that can actually sometimes be viewed as a positive in the marketplace. But in general, there's quite a bit of education that has to happen, because sometimes if you're labeled a troubled business, it's like having a scarlet letter on your chest in the marketplace. And so there's lots of pluses and minuses to that, and it requires a really good agent to be able to explain to people that, yeah, this is a troubled business under the EB-5 definition, but the business really isn't in all that much trouble, because the investor isn't going to want to invest in a troubled business and not even have the 10 jobs preserved.
And I'll translate that. Find a good agent to explain it to the investors. Pay more, like a lot more.
All right, thank you both very much. I think we're going to transition, and they'll both be available, volunteering you, to answer more questions at the end of the second panel as we move into the cocktails. Dan and John.
By the way.
Do we need a break? Is everybody okay moving straight into the second panel? All right.